Hola, soy Ángela Pérez, subgerente cultural del Banco de la República y quiero invitarlos a que conozcan el proyecto El Río Territorios Posibles, en el que estamos trabajando desde la red cultural a nivel nacional. Estamos explorando las relaciones económicas, geográficas, medioambientales, históricas, literarias, míticas que hemos establecido con nuestros ríos. En particular, quiero invitarlos al ciclo de conversaciones Hablemos del Río, en el que Camilo Jiménez hablará con expertas y expertos nacionales e internacionales sobre cómo imaginar y entender unas relaciones que hagan de los ríos territorios posibles. Bienvenidos.
Muy buenos días a todos. Aquí estamos de nuevo con ustedes en esta tercera semana de conversaciones de nuestro proyecto Hablemos del Río. Les quiero dar las gracias a quienes nos han acompañado en las 4 charlas que ya hemos llevado a cabo en este ciclo. Me refiero a las conversaciones que tuve hace 8 días y hace 15 días con la activista del Río Cauca, Isabel Zuleta, con el curador del Museo del Río Magdalena, Germán Ferro, con el profesor emérito de EAFIT, Juan Darío Restrepo, y con la líder social de Guapi, Aurelena González. Me alegra mucho saberlos de nuevo aquí con nosotros para escuchar esta primera conversación del día de hoy, que es con el experto británico Robert Oates, quien ha sido, entre otras cosas, una de las personas responsables de la resurrección del río Támesis de Londres. A quienes hasta ahora se conectan con nosotros les quiero dar la bienvenida a este ciclo de conversaciones que para mí y para el Banco de la República es un sueño hecho realidad. Quiero darle la bienvenida a esta serie de charlas titulada Hablemos del Río, que arrancó el pasado 5 de octubre y que ustedes podrán ver semanalmente hasta finales de este mes a través de las redes sociales y las plataformas digitales del Banco de la República. Les doy esta bienvenida con mucha emoción porque en el corazón de esta iniciativa no solo hay preocupaciones y urgencias, sino que también está nuestra voluntad de aportar al cambio. Con esas conversaciones queremos aportar al cambio, en primer lugar porque en este proyecto creemos en la urgencia de no ignorar más nuestro vínculo vital, individual y colectivo con los ríos de nuestro país. Ese vínculo con los ríos es nuestro lazo con la naturaleza, es nuestro compromiso con cientos de comunidades e identidades y es también, en el fondo, una apuesta por el futuro de Colombia. En segundo lugar, en estas charlas nos mueve una necesidad, la necesidad de activarnos como habitantes del mundo. Nosotros somos seres pensantes y sintientes, pero creo que necesitamos ser también más conscientes y más sensibles frente a la importancia de los ríos en nuestro país. Por las aguas de nuestros ríos corren vidas, corren tradiciones y saberes. Por los ríos corre la ciencia, corren también las claves de nuestro desarrollo económico y social y corre la perspectiva de una sociedad más sostenible, más digna y más respetuosa del planeta. Por último, estas charlas surgen de la voluntad del Banco de la República, a la cual yo adhiero completamente, de creer en el poder del diálogo. Estamos convencidos de que la expresión y la escucha son espacios legítimos para conseguir que esta sociedad en que vivimos sea realmente democrática y plural. Antes de presentarles a Robert Oates, nuestro invitado a esta charla, quiero hablarles brevemente del proyecto que inspira y hace posible estas conversaciones. Me refiero a El Río Territorios Posibles, un proyecto de magnitud nacional de la Subgerencia Cultural del Banco de la República. Desde su inicio, en enero de este año, el Río Territorios Posibles ha buscado explorar nuestra relación y nuestra convivencia con los ríos de Colombia a través de 3 preguntas. En primer lugar, ¿cómo vivimos con el río? En segundo lugar, ¿cómo contamos el río? Y la última pregunta tiene que ver con los desafíos individuales y sociales que implica pensar y convivir con el río o con los ríos en este país. El Banco de la República y nosotros en estas charlas queremos responder esas preguntas de la mano de comunidades de todo el país y de individuos y colectivos que han dedicado su energía a defender el río. Por eso, el proyecto El Río Territorios Posibles se ha venido desarrollando en los centros culturales del Banco de la República en 29 ciudades distintas, así como en el mundo digital a través de contenidos muy diversos. Uno de esos contenidos son estas charlas Hablemos del Río. Este proyecto en particular al que ustedes asisten hoy consiste de 8 charlas y, como les venía diciendo, 4 de las 8 conversaciones ya tuvieron lugar. Yo quiero invitarlos a que visiten el canal de YouTube del Banco de la República y conozcan esas charlas. Y quiero invitarlos a que nos sigan acompañando porque, como les conté, hoy tenemos 2 charlas. Una es la que empezaré en pocos instantes con Robert Oates y una más es la que podrán ver en un ratito al cierre de esta primera charla con el historiador Daniel Jiménez. La semana entrante, nuestro ciclo terminará con 2 últimos invitados. El lunes 26 de octubre hablaré con el antropólogo Daniel Ruiz Serna y también con una invitada internacional. Ella se llama Marcela Mella Ortiz, es una activista chilena que, entre otras cosas, lidera la defensa del río Maipo allá en su país. Este proyecto seguirá en 2021 y reunirá aún más voces, incluyendo, por supuesto, entre otras, la mirada de los pueblos indígenas de Colombia. Bueno, entonces conmigo para hablar de la ida y el regreso del infierno, la muerte y el nacimiento del río Támesis, está hoy aquí una de esas personas que han entregado su vida a entender los ríos del mundo, pero sobre todo a liderar y unir activistas, científicos y políticos en torno a la necesidad y la posibilidad de garantizar la vida de los ríos. Quiero darle un saludo muy especial a Robert Oates, que es londinense de nacimiento, pero actualmente vive en un pueblo llamado Sleaford, ubicado a orillas del pequeño río Slee, desde donde se ha conectado para hablar con nosotros para esta cita. Entonces, al hablar con Robert voy a pasar al inglés. Las personas que necesiten una traducción la encontrarán de manera simultánea mientras se desarrolla la conversación. Robert, first of all, thank you very much for being here with us. I'd like to give you the word so you can say hello to our audience.
Hello to everybody in Colombia, and thank you, Camilo, and thank you to the bank for inviting me to be part of this exciting program.
It is a pleasure to have you here, Robert. Just a couple of two things more in Spanish. Quiero contarles que en las últimas semanas hemos venido recogiendo preguntas de nuestro público y que estoy muy agradecido por la atención que mereció esta charla. Yo intentaré ir incluyendo algunas de esas preguntas a lo largo de la conversación y al final, si el tiempo nos lo permite, agregaré más. Okay, so the 3 talks that we have had so far in this project have been fabulous. With the activist Isabel Zuleta, we learned about the struggle of the Cauca River communities. With Germán Ferro, the director of the Magdalena Museum, we could give a glimpse to the history and the cultural power of that river. With Juan Darío Restrepo, we were able to open our eyes to how rivers define the present and the future of critical issues for most people in Colombia. And with Aurelena González from Guapi, a small town near the Pacific coast, we heard about leadership and the role of women in the defense of rivers. However, until today, we had not been able to open our scope and look to the world. For example, to look to questions as how are rivers in other parts of our planet? Which role do they play in other cultures? How are people in other nations managing to live with rivers without literally killing them? This talk today is our opportunity to make that journey. So, Robert, I'd like to start this conversation talking to you about a part of your life that not everyone expects you to have. Before you became world famous for reviving the Thames River in London, and this, of course, will be a topic we'll talk about later in this conversation, you had another life. You studied English and you worked for 20 years for the government service in London. And then, when you became 40, you decided to make a shift and devote yourself to nature and wildlife conservation. I'd like to talk about this, Robert. Working in the government service was a great thing. You were well paid and you had great benefits. So what happened? What made you quit, decide to go back to the university and head to the rivers of the world?
Well, Camilo, I was always interested in the natural world from a young age. And when working in the government service, I spent all of my free time outdoors watching wildlife. And the more I watched wildlife, the more I realized that nature was being lost in my country and all around the world. So in my 40th year, I realized that I had to try to do something about that. And I went back to university and changed career to nature conservation. After university, I was lucky to find a first job in making a plan for a small river in England. And since then, I have been lucky to find jobs on rivers all around the world. I was also inspired to change careers by my hero, David Attenborough, who did the same thing. He quit a senior job in the BBC in London in middle age to go and make his famous wildlife documentaries.
That's true. David Attenborough, maybe for the people who don't know him, he's a very, very famous, what do you call that, narrator? Or, I mean, his voice is famous because it's the voice of these documentaries you're talking about, right?
Yes, he's probably the world's most famous wildlife broadcaster.
That's true, David Attenborough. Okay, Robert. So I want to go a little bit, back to your years in the government service, because there you were active in the health department, making plans for hospitals, and then you came to river restoration and conservation. So I want to ask you. Did that experience before working for the government, working in health, working in hospitals, help you somehow to start new conversations in this new area of river restoration? Did it help you to bring together maybe scientists, activists, and politicians? What was decisive in your case and in your role for the things you did afterwards in relationship with rivers?
Well, working in the government service taught me a lot about a lot of things that most scientists do not usually experience. Working in the government service taught me a lot about politics and politicians and how they operate and the kind of things they need to help them succeed in what they want to do. Working in the government service also taught me many skills, such as how to make plans and budgets. But most importantly, it taught me how to bring together people from different backgrounds and different organizations to work together in cooperation. And I'm sure we will talk a bit later about the importance of making plans for river restoration. But without people working together, no plan can succeed. So I have spent a lot of my career being a kind of diplomat, helping to bring people together to understand their river and helping them to understand that everyone will benefit if they all work together in cooperation.
Yeah, of course we will talk about that later, Robert. But before really going deep in this terrain of planning how rivers can be restored and conservated, I wanted to make you a very open question for start. Your work as a conservationist has led you to different organizations. Among others, there is one that many people in Colombia know, called WWF, the Panda logo organization. And there you worked in river restoration and in the creation of wetlands for wildlife and water management. And you have also explored rivers in India, China, Mexico, Brazil, and South Africa. I believe I'm not mentioning a lot of countries you've been to. And then in recent years, you were even 3 times in Colombia, as you told me in a talk we had before, visiting the Siete Ríos Fest in Cali and the Bird Fair, also in Cali. So just for start and talking about rivers, Robert, I would like to know which, if you can mention it, is your favorite river in the world and why?
Well, from a professional point of view, my favorite river to work on is the Yangtze in Asia. a river which begins in the mountains of Tibet and flows across China to enter the Pacific Ocean at the port city of Shanghai. The Yangtze is the third largest river in the world at over 6,000 kilometers long. And it has all of the problems that we see on many other rivers around the world. But it also has large areas that are unspoiled and beautiful and full of wildlife. But the Yangtze is unusual in that the entire river flows through one country, which is China. So the Chinese government has been able to make a plan for the management of the whole river from its source to the sea. And they have created a river basin management committee to put that plan into action. And that committee is composed of representatives from scientific backgrounds, technical experts, local communities, regional government, national government, and they're all working together to decide what actions they will do, who will do these actions, and who will pay for them. And the plan that they have produced is not perfect. Compromises have to be made to protect people sometimes, or to protect the economy or the environment. But it is better than having no plan at all. And that plan on the River Yangtze is producing results, which is why I like working so much on that river. But from a personal point of view, my favorite river in the world is one that almost nobody has heard of. And this is quite a large river, again, nearly 1,000 kilometers long. But it is a river called the Shebele, which begins in the mountains of Ethiopia in East Africa and flows across Somalia into the Indian Ocean. And this is a very remote and wild part of Africa, which I visited in 2015. And the river itself is completely wild and unspoilt by humans. It is a rare example of how rivers looked before humans began to alter them. And the River Shebele is a very varied river. Its banks have cliffs and forests and open grasslands. There are lots of animals in the river and lots of birds around. It's a rare example of a completely natural river, and it has been a huge inspiration for me.
A beautiful river, which I sadly haven't had the chance to visit. And maybe lots of people in our audience also haven't had the chance to see. How come it has been conserved in that way? Has it been because humans just haven't gotten near that river and invaded it as they have invaded other rivers, or does it have to do with conservation plans in Ethiopia?
No, it is mainly to do with the fact that the part of East Africa that the Shebele flows through is a very barren region. It's very dry. The soil is not good for agriculture. So people have not moved into that area. And in recent years, you may know the country of Somalia has had problems with Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism, and the government has almost fallen apart in Somalia. So it's a very difficult and dangerous place to go to. I was only able to go there because I was visiting Ethiopia, and I was taken to see the top part of the Shebele River, which flows through Ethiopia.
Okay. And before continuing with our talk, a small follow-up question about the Yangtze River you just mentioned and the big plan they have in China for conservation, for its conservation. The plan is designed with more or less how much years of a term? I mean, those are long-term plans.
Yes, it's a long-term plan. It begins with a 5-year period, and then there is a 10-year period, and then there is a 25-year period.
And after 25 years, the Yangtze has to be a river of clear waters and completely restored river.
Well, The people of China hope so, and the government of China hope so. Of course, one of the problems with working on rivers is that rivers are not static. Rivers are changing all of the time. The climate is changing around us. The impacts we are having on rivers, we do not fully understand them. And so we cannot be sure that what we do today will result in a specific result in 5 years or 10 years. So what we have to do is at the end of each of those periods is to look at the plan again, look at the science, look at the evidence, look at whether what we have done has succeeded or not. And then we have to revise the plan and amend the plan to fit the new situation.
Okay, so Robert, many of us have never been at the Yangtze River or at the Ganges River in India or in the Mississippi in the U.S. But rivers, but we know rivers in Colombia. We have thousands of rivers in this country. The country is crossed by them and defined by them. Rivers are complex systems, and they are very different to each other. That's something that we have learned in these talks, talking with experts, with Colombian experts. But I would like to turn this impression around and ask you, Robert, about rivers in the world have in common. I'd like to know what, in this 21st century we're living in, what they share. Could you give us some light on that?
Yes. Well, the most important thing that all rivers in the world share is the same thing that they have always shared through the whole of the history of humanity. And that is that rivers provide essential benefits for people. Without rivers and the water they provide, we could not survive. If somebody locked you in a room and threw away the key, you would not die of hunger, you would die of thirst. Water is the most essential substance on the planet for all life. But the good news is that all rivers of the world follow the same science, and that science is well understood by experts across the world, including experts in your universities and government agencies there in Colombia. So for every river in the world, we can understand its problems and we can produce solutions. Not all of those solutions are perfect, but we do know ways in which we can help every river to be improved. The big problem everywhere, of course, is persuading people to work together to put those solutions into action.
Yeah. And now that we're talking about common things among rivers, I believe rivers in the world, I believe also a very common thing, or I believe they also share more or less the same problems. What would you say could be the top three, or just mentioning a number, the top three of problems that rivers in the world live nowadays?
Well, Camilo, yes. I would say that the first top problem that all of the damaged rivers in the world face is the physical damage which we humans have made to them. As our populations grow, we take more and more clean water from rivers and we put more and more pollution back into them so that rivers dry up and their plants and their fish and their wildlife then die. We alter riverbanks to prevent flooding, but that just pushes the flood further down the river onto the next community. We drain wetlands for agriculture, and activities like mining can destroy the natural environment along the river, as well as poisoning the water. But the second kind of problem is the political problem. Governments need to make good laws to protect rivers and water supplies. They need to create a management plan for each river and a management committee to implement that plan. And a government agency must be given strong powers to lead this process. Until this second kind of problem is solved, then the physical problems of the rivers will never be solved.
Mm.
And the third important thing is the damage from climate change, which is caused by global heating. We know that all countries need to work on reducing their emissions of greenhouse gases, If not, the planet will become so hot that all rivers will dry up and humans can no longer survive. And we do not have another planet to go to.
Robert, I'll take advantage from you mentioning mining, well, legal or illegal mining, to mention that a user of the, the Instagram account of the Banco de la República here in Colombia has made a question, wants to ask you something actually related with gold mining. Regarding rivers from tropical regions like the Amazon or the Pacific, the question of the user is if you think they could be restored despite profound damage inflicted by gold mining.
Yes, I think they can. Of course, all forms of mining can be damaging to rivers and water resources. But countries like Australia have shown that the damage caused by mining can be reduced and that rivers can be restored, at least partially. This question takes us back, of course, to the need to have a management plan and a management committee for each river, and for all users of the river to be invited to sit down with that committee and work out how they can make their activities as least damaging as possible. Because miners need to make a living like everyone else. They need to feed their families, and I'm sure that they do not take pleasure in destroying the environment. So if a river basin management committee is formed, it can work with the miners to maybe find alternative employment for them so that they are not doing damaging activity. Or if no alternative employment is available, then a system of regulating the mining needs to be put in place. Miners could be licensed to operate in the areas where they would cause the least damage, and they could be required to restore the river or the land after they have finished. And of course, this is a compromise, but many of the decisions that we have to make on rivers are compromises. There is no perfect solution. The alternative would be anarchy, where a few people win and a great many people lose.
I believe your approach would be then very similar when talking about, for example, dams. Colombia is a country struggling for development, for economic, social development. And in this country, we're always at the end of the road, confronting this big problem, this big dilemma between should we head faster towards that goal, or should we stop and take into account what we're damaging? What about dams? What about infrastructure? Is the approach the same?
Well, my approach is the same as WWF and many other river scientists across the world. I'm sorry to keep repeating myself, but I must say that every river needs to be looked at as a whole system, and the implications of any change to a river need to be judged against the damage it might cause to another part of the river. The problem with most dams is that they are planned and constructed to bring only one benefit, such as hydropower, to one part of the country or to one part of the community. They do not usually balance that benefit with the loss of benefits to other communities or to other sectors. The result is that usually one sector gains a large profit, while other sectors and other communities see large losses. And this is not fair. It's not fair socially, it's not fair environmentally, and it's not fair economically. And in the long run, it's actually not good for the development of the whole country. So it is worth taking some time, even in the urgent need to develop and provide for your people. It is worth taking some time to sit down, as I say, with all the people affected and take, some time to consider what are the impacts of this proposed dam. Is it just short-term thinking? Is it really going to solve the problem? Or is there an alternative way of providing the same benefit, which has a long-term solution? So, for example, to provide hydroelectricity in many parts of the world, such as Colombia, tropical country, the sun shines a lot. You have high mountains, so you could use solar power, you could use wind power as alternatives to hydroelectricity. So another way in which electricity can be generated is by using rivers, but not by putting a dam across the whole river, but by creating a side channel where some of the water could be diverted to power turbines. And again, this is a compromise, but as I said earlier, if we want to manage our rivers sustainably in the long term, we are always going to have to make some sort of compromise.
Sure. We'll continue talking about this, your proposal or your big idea you shared with many organizations of developing river basin management plans. But I had a little question, maybe one small question before we go to that big, thick topic, and that has to do with the rivers as connected organisms. Rivers, and we have learned that in this series of talks, they link geographical regions, ecosystems, communities, cultures, and possibilities for social and economic development. So what you do in one place affects the other places. Can this also mean, Robert, that rivers in different parts of the world are connected with each other? And could we think of the rivers of the world as one system we should all care about? That would be my last question to the global topic.
Yes, I think we should think about all rivers in the world as being part of one system, in the same way that we think about all of the oceans of the world as being connected together and being part of one system. What happens on one river can affect other rivers. For example, if one river is damaged or dries up completely so that people can no longer use it, then they migrate to another area and they put even more pressure on other rivers, so that there is a domino effect until all the rivers in a country can become badly damaged and human society can collapse. And this is already happening in parts of West Africa, where the lack of water is forcing people to leave their home areas and move to slums in the cities, or even to risk their lives trying to get to Europe by illegal means. And of course, many species of wildlife rely on different rivers in different parts of the world. Many bird species, for example, migrate between the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere, water birds especially. And if their river habitat is damaged or destroyed at one end of their migration, then they cannot survive, and they will disappear from both the north and the south. And those birds are the indicators of the health of our rivers. If we see them disappearing, then it is a warning sign that the river itself might disappear. So we need those birds, and we need them to study them as an early warning system of signs that things are going wrong in our environment. And we can study those same birds on different rivers in the different hemispheres to understand what is happening.
Okay. Was that actually the reason, I'm sure among others, why you were invited to the Bird Fair in Cali?
Absolutely, yes. I spoke on this very subject in the Bird Fair in Cali last year. The subject of bird migration between the north and the south, and how birds connect habitats in South America to habitats in North America.
How interesting. Robert, let's now make a shift and let's talk about solutions. You're an expert in bringing solutions to rivers in trouble, and you have always insisted in the importance, as you just mentioned it a couple of times, of developing river basin management plans. The bigger the plan, the better the solution, I suppose, or is what I conclude of what you have said today. Your opinion is that these plans have to be the result of politicians and scientists working together, designing them. I would like you to explain that for starting. You have spent your life in meetings with experts as well as with politicians and decision makers. Why does this partnership between science and politics tend to fail in so many countries, and I'm including Colombia among those countries? What does science need to change and maybe have more impact among politicians? And what do politicians have to do to listen better, maybe? What is your view of this whole complex?
Well, as I said, governments need to make good laws to protect rivers and water supplies. They need to create a management plan for each river. That management plan can be big for a big river like the Cauca, but it can be broken down into smaller components so that, for example, you can have a plan for each department along the river. And then within each department, like the Valle de Cauca, you can have a plan for one part of the river, for example, that part of the river which flows through Cali. And so you can break it down into smaller pieces and work on smaller pieces of the river. But if every department worked on its own stretch of the river at the same time in cooperation, then the whole river would get restored and everyone would benefit. But this kind of political solution will only happen if people put pressure on their politicians to make it happen through voting and publicity and other kinds of activism that I'm sure we will talk about. And this is not a question of right wing or left wing. All around the world, there are politicians in every kind of political party who realize that a healthy society and a healthy economy rely on healthy natural resources such as rivers and fresh water. And this is an issue which can unite people across the political divide.
And do you think science is being listened to? I mean, do politicians, do decision makers, are they really available there to hear and to really incorporate or build in their decisions and in their plans what science is saying in this world that is actually able to doubt in facts and information?
Yes, they are. Not everywhere, not at the same time, and often not fast enough. But there are examples in Colombia. For example, from my visits to Cali, I have seen the department of the Valle de Cauca taking the first steps to set up a river basin technical committee of the experts from the universities and other government agencies, and including some community representatives. And that technical committee is taking the first steps to produce a plan for the River Cauca in the department of the Valle de Cauca territory. That is a really good start. I think what will be good will be to see the national government of Colombia supporting the department of the Valle de Cauca in producing that river basin technical committee and in producing a river basin plan for that department, and then using that as a good example for the whole country to learn from.
And going back to what you just mentioned about citizens and citizens participating in this process and activism being strong in pushing science and political politicians and political movements toward change. Could you maybe give us some examples from other places you have been, Robert? Not necessarily London, because we will talk about London later, but maybe some examples where people have been really, have had the way of changing things. And I'm asking you because in Colombia we have had a difficult time when struggling for a place in decision making, and we have had a difficult time for activism to really have the presence it needs to have. Are there any examples you would like to underscore?
Yes, there are. Of course, activism and civil movements have a very important part to play in the process. River basin management plans can only succeed when they have the support of all sectors and all communities. And often river basin committees and management plans are only created as a result of pressure from communities and civil movements. And I do not mean violent pressure. I mean good examples, people doing things themselves, people showing through publicity that they care about their rivers and they want something done about it. And I have an example of this from the country of Malaysia, where I was invited to go and visit and work with their technical experts and government agencies on a plan for the Clang River, which flows through Kuala Lumpur, which is the capital of Malaysia. And the Clang River had many of the typical problems of rivers around the world, especially rivers in urban areas. The buildings had been built right up to the edge of the river. The river itself had been set in concrete. There was no place for extra water to go when there was very heavy rainfall. So there was often frequent flooding in the city. People's homes were flooded, and also, very importantly, many businesses were flooded. So this was causing a big problem. So we got together with the city administration, the technical experts from the university, with representatives from the community and from the businesses, and we worked out a plan to improve the river outside of the city so that the floodwater could be stored outside of the city before it came in, and therefore would not damage the city itself. And that plan was agreed, and also the industries which were affected by the flooding, they agreed to buy the land outside the city for the new floodwater storage area, because by having that area in place, they were protecting their own businesses. So we found a kind of a win-win solution for everybody. And that is the kind of process that I use when I'm invited to help with rivers all around the world. It's sitting down and looking at where the problems are coming from, how we can solve those problems, and who can help to deliver those solutions. I mean, there are many examples of this around the world. Australia, for example, I've worked on rivers in Australia. They had a long history of the colonialists arriving, the English colonialists, I'm sorry to say, arriving in that country, a completely new country, alien country. They did not understand it in the same way as the Aboriginal people, and they tried to manage the land and the rivers in the same way that they did back home in England, and that did not work in Australia at all. It was a disaster for Australian rivers. So they have had a long and difficult and expensive process of having to work together and work with people like WWF to find a way to manage their rivers which is suitable for the climate of that place and the geology of that place and the people of that place.
Robert, what would you suggest to do in countries like Colombia, where time and again consensus end up broken by particular agendas, ideological battles, social disputes? For example, I imagine if we wait for a government that is really willing to lead such a plan, we could stay waiting many years. And in the meanwhile, we could maybe actually kill some rivers here in Colombia. So what are your ideas in this? And you just mentioned something about local work in local rivers, but is that the solution? Is it a possible solution if it is not articulated?
Well, I think the answer is that we all have to work on all of the levels that we can. even an individual who has never been involved in their river before can help to be part of the solution and not be part of the problem. And we all know that activism can be very powerful. I'm sure we all know the example of Greta Thunberg, the Swedish schoolgirl who decided to go on strike from school every Friday of the week and go and sit outside the Swedish parliament holding a simple poster saying that she was on strike for climate change. And in just a few years, that idea and that activism has spread to millions of young people all around the world. And I would really love to see that kind of action spread amongst people for their rivers as well. Because at the local level, there are things that people can do, and at the regional level and the national level as well. So at the local level, for example, I would say, if you have a restoration group for your local river, then go and join it and help them to do what they're trying to do. And if you do not have a restoration group for your local river, then start one. I can guarantee that other people will come and join you. This is a cause that very many people care about. Even if you only get together on one Sunday morning a month and take the rubbish out of the river, this will attract attention and generate publicity, and more people will come and join you and do the same thing. And also, these kind of activities are an opportunity to invite the government agencies to come and see what you're doing and invite them to work with you and work together to use their resources and their experts and their money and their machinery to improve your bit of your river. And when you are doing these activities, you can also invite the politicians to come along and show them that the local people care about this river and that they want them as a politician to do something about it. And so from this small beginning, the thing can grow and grow. And then at the level of your town or your city, you could organize a river festival, which will have a bigger impression, a more impact, and reach out to more people. When I went to Cali in May 2018 for the Siete Rios Fest, I saw a wonderful example of people coming together from right across the city, from poor neighborhoods, rich neighborhoods, all kinds of people united together in celebrating their rivers and working together to restore their rivers. And these events can show the governments and government agencies at the regional level and the city level also that people care and encourage them to do something. And then once you have the involvement at that level, at the kind of regional government level, as I said, they have in the Valle de Cauca, and then the regional government can put pressure on the national government to follow this same kind of solution. And also at the national level, you can not just work on politicians, but you can support organizations like WWF in Colombia, which are very good at lobbying government at the national level and helping them find the kind of rules and regulations that are needed at that level. So there is no magic solution, there is no quick solution, but there are things that people can do at different levels, and everybody who does do something and takes some action helps us all to get to the solution faster.
Now that you're talking about levels, I'd like to go to a question of a user in Instagram who is particularly interested in the, let's say, individual level. And he wants to know, and I'll read, is using, for example, certain soaps something that could help damage rivers less? What would you recommend for day-to-day challenges?
Yes, that is a real problem. Most soaps and soap powders that we use in washing machines have a very high level of a substance in them called phosphate. And phosphate is a chemical that is very damaging to rivers. But there are alternatives. You can buy soaps and washing powder which is low in phosphate. So I would advise that person when they next go to the supermarket to buy their soap or their washing powder to read the label on the packet carefully and choose the soap powder which has the lowest level of phosphate in it. And 10 years ago, we had a campaign here in the UK about using low phosphate washing powder in washing machines. And the national women's football team of Scotland became part of this campaign. And they promised to wash all of their football kit in low phosphate washing powder. That generated a huge amount of publicity, which was very good for us.
Mm-hmm. And apart from that, which other objects of our daily life have such strong impact on rivers? Now that we're talking about that, Robert.
Well, the number one impact on rivers on many in many parts of the world, and also I'm sorry to say on many of the 7 rivers in Cali that I've seen, has been the plastic rubbish floating on the surface. We all know plastic is damaging for the environment. Plastic takes hundreds of years to break down in the environment, and rivers can become literally covered in plastic, which kills all of the life in the river. So please dispose of your plastic safely. Do not put it somewhere where it might accidentally get blown into a river or washed into a river. Dispose of it safely. And as I said, if your river is full of plastic, then if you form a group which maybe even only occasionally goes out and takes the plastic out of the river and puts it somewhere where it's safe, then you will see a huge improvement in that river in just a matter of weeks. The plants will come back, the wildlife will come back, the river will be cleaner, and it will be a much more attractive place.
Robert, the last part of this talk, I have planned it and I did that intentionally for you to speak about your experience in London with the Thames River. And I would like you to speak in detail about that. You have been invited to give talks about river restoration all around the world, in great part because of the work you did bringing that river back to life. So for starting, I would like to know something. The Thames was one of the very first major rivers in our planet to be declared dead as a consequence of human activity. So what does death mean exactly when talking about a river? How did the Thames River get killed?
Well, the River Thames was declared dead by scientists in 1950. And since it was declared dead, we have done a lot of work to improve it and bring it back to life. Mm-hmm. And that is the reason why we say the River Thames has gone to hell and back.
Yeah.
And what we meant by dead was biologically dead. What those scientists meant that was when they surveyed the river in 1950, they could find no single living thing in that river. There were no birds, no fish, no animals, just a few worms in the mud at the bottom of the river. So it was biologically dead. The river was just an open sewer, full of the wastewater from millions of toilets in the City of London, full of pollution from thousands of factories, and full of chemicals from agriculture coming from hundreds of kilometres up the river. And all of these damaging activities had been going on for more than 200 years, because the UK, you may know, was the first country in the world to have an industrial revolution. We were the first country, as a result of that industrial revolution, to have a super dense population. and we were the first country to have chemical farming. So we were the first country to learn the hard lessons that all of these things can kill a river if they are not regulated and controlled. And a dirty river can kill people also, of course. Dirty water can contain many diseases and many pollutants and many poisons for people. And back in the summer of 1850, the River Thames was so dirty and so polluted that over 20,000 people died that summer from cholera in the City of London. So since 1950, we have taken a lot of actions, and we have had to spend a lot of money to make our river clean and healthy again, so that it is no longer biologically dead. And as we say, it has come back from hell.
That's very impressive, Robert, because many people, among which I count myself in, for example, if we give a glimpse to a river in Bogota called Río Bogotá, which is a river that we really don't know very well, and the very, very exact moments in which we have contact with that river are moments in which we feel its bad smell, or just see, it's very, very, very strange, almost death-like waters. It's interesting to know that it is possible to reverse that and to change that completely, as you did that in London. I'd like to ask you two things about the process of revival of the Thames River. Maybe because it was recuperated, as you just told us, it cost billions of pounds and many years of efforts. But now the Thames River has water that can be, it's actually the drinking water of London, and more than 140 species of fish live in it. So how was that done? And maybe let's start with the more technical part of that. How was it really done?
Well, since the 1950s, a huge amount of work has been done to restore the river, as you say, and it has been done by many people, not just me, obviously. I'm only one person in a long chain of people who have been working on the restoration of the River Thames. And now I have retired from full-time working. Of course, there are other people who are still working on the River Thames, because we do not want to stand still. We continually want to improve the river and also make it safe, as I said earlier, from the impacts that we know will be coming from climate change. But the technical ways in which the river was improved were actually ways which were not very complicated. They did not involve very high levels of science. They were the kinds of things which engineers all around the world know how to do very well. If only somebody asks them to do it and pays them to do it, that they know how to do it very well. So, for example, what we did on the Thames, and from what you're saying about the river in Bogota, it seems that it probably needs the same kind of investment. We put a lot of money into new freshwater supply systems, and a lot of money was spent on sewage treatment systems so that the pollution did not go into the river. And there has also been the installation of pollution control systems in industry, on all of the factories and other businesses which previously put their pollution into the river as a free drain. Those industries have been required by government to put pollution control systems in place. And also the government has required there to be controls over the chemicals used in agriculture. So all those various things prevented the pollution going into the river. And as a result, the river itself has purified itself as the rain falls and flows down the river. Rivers do not actually need anybody to look after them. Rivers only have problems because we humans impact them in negative ways. If we leave rivers alone, they can heal themselves and clean themselves. What we have to do is clean up our impacts on the rivers. And all of those things I mentioned, those engineering solutions, new drains, new sewers, new water supply systems, new flood defences, they did cost hundreds of millions of dollars. But the cost was paid by a combination of money from central government, from central taxes, money from local government, money from industry, and also money coming from the water bills that every consumer in the city paid. A small part of their water bill went towards the cleanup of the river. And even today in London, everybody who lives in London and pays a water bill, each month they pay the equivalent of $1, which goes towards the restoration of the river. That's not a large amount of money, but 10 million people each month paying $1. That means we have $10 million each month to still spend on restoring our river.
And when officially did the river come out of hell? I mean, you talked about the 1950s. When did this whole story end, and when were you able to declare it alive again?
Well, it was not declared alive at any one particular place in time, but 10 years ago, there is each year an annual river restoration conference, which is funded by the Tice Corporation of Australia. And every year that river restoration conference gives a prize for the best restored river in the world. And in the year 2010, the River Thames won that prize for the best restored river in the world. So personally, I would count that as the date from when we emerged from hell and the whole world knew about it.
Incredible. 50, 60 years after declaring that. Just for finishing our conversation, Robert, I'd like to share with us maybe a couple of reflections about the future. And let's try to see that future in two ways. One would be the pessimistic one would be the optimistic one. How do you imagine the future in, let's say, year 2030? If we don't do much more to restaurate our rivers, or if we do?
Well, in 2030, if we have not taken more action to restore, most rivers around the world will be in a very poor condition. Most rivers around the world will not be able to support human populations. And already 80% of the people on this planet are in a situation of not having enough fresh water for their daily needs. So we're at a critical point. We must conserve water. We must restore our rivers. Otherwise, the negative impacts on people will be huge. There will be big impacts on health. There will be big impacts on economies. And the quality of life for millions of people will be even worse. But I'm an optimist. I have always been an optimist, and I have to be an optimist in the work that I do. So I believe that by 2030, actually, the things that I'm looking for will become much more common around the world. They will become activities which are adopted by all governments, and are activities which will be seen on all the rivers of the world. There are three main things that I want to see by 2030. I want to see every community around the world supporting its river and not giving up on its river. No matter how badly damaged it is now, do not give up on your river. It can be improved, it can be restored. Okay, it will not be as good as the original pristine condition, but it will be able to supply many of the benefits that people need from their river. And the second thing is that it is cheaper to restore your river today than to do it in 10 years' time. In 10 years' time, the damage will be bigger, the cost will be bigger. So the more you can do now, the less it will cost in 10 years' time, the less it will cost future generations. And my third and final point, sorry to keep saying the same thing so often, but every river by 2030, I hope, will have a river basin management plan and a good committee to implement that plan and support from all the users of that river so that everyone is working together to have a clean river, a healthy river, and that everybody along that river has a fair share of its benefits. And if those three messages are followed, then I am sure that rivers around the world, including your rivers in Colombia, will stay healthy, will help your society become even healthier and richer, and your rivers will not go to hell and back as we did on the River Thames.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. I think those were very, very good and inspiring final words. I want to thank everybody for being here with us, for the questions, and I would like to invite you all to to stay with us. In some moments, I'll be speaking with the historian Daniel Jimenez, and well, thank you very much, Robert. See you next time.
Thank you for inviting me, and if anybody in Colombia wants my advice on their river, please invite me. I will come over anytime.